Welcome to another Innovation Forum podcast. My name is Toby Webb, founder of Innovation Forum, and I'm delighted to kick off a new series, a quarterly series in sustainable apparel and textiles coverage from us at Innovation Forum. As many listeners may know, we hold an annual conference on this subject, and we have one coming up in April, and it should be a doozy, as they say, across the Atlantic. So please check Innovation Forum for details on our Sustainable Apparel and Textiles Conference. And I'm delighted that one of our partners and supporters for that conference, Textile Exchange's Larry Pepper, who is co-founder and CEO of Textile Exchange, is joining me for the first of our podcast series. So welcome, Larry. How are you today?
Doing very well, Toby. It's great to be with you.
Thanks so much for joining us. Now, we were going to talk a little bit about what Textile Exchange is and then what perhaps has caught your eye in the news recently to keep us topical. But then we're going to have a little dive into organic cotton. And then in the following podcast, we'll cover other materials. And that way, listeners, there'll be a little series in about a year's time where you can go to and have a guide of different materials and the sustainability issues. And we think that could be quite useful. So, Larry, first of all, for those listeners who aren't familiar with Textile Exchange, tell us briefly about your organization and what you do.
Textile Exchange is a global organization that works on inspiring and equipping people to drive the adoption of preferred fibers. So when we think about what is a preferred fiber, it's a fiber that's having a more positive impact, whether it's on people or planet or water or biodiversity. So we work with a portfolio approach across about 500 different brands, retailers, and supply chain members in order to, again, drive that adoption of preferred fibers. Our goal is to have a positive impact on climate and people.
Well, it's certainly an impressive organisation. I would commend listeners to take a look at the Textile Exchange site. There's a huge amount of work going on. Obviously, Larry, climate change is a huge theme this year and, of course, for every year to come until we decarbonise our contribution to the planet, which will take many a decade. Just tell me, what are your plans around climate change and climate action during this year? And then we can move on to get more specific about cotton.
Actually, our board just rolled out and approved about a year's work that we've done on creating a benchmark on where we are with fibers right now and the impact that we can have with preferred fibers. We've rolled out our Climate Plus strategy for delivery of a reduction of 45% greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. This is a bold and audacious goal, and it means it's going to be all the above strategy. It's going to be moving the cotton industry into preferred fibers and wool and man-made cellulosics and really reinforcing regenerative agriculture and all the land-based fibers and circular and recycled solutions when it comes to synthetics. So it's an all the above strategy to reduce those greenhouse gases by 45%. So we've got phenomenal response from our membership in support of this.
And just give our listeners, Larry, a sense of who your membership are. You can often define it in some cases by who's not in it, in the sense of how much of the industry do you reach and how much further do you...
Well over 80% of the key members, all the way from West Coast in the United States, the Nikes and Patagonias, large ones, Targets, Walmart, Guess Jeans, Levi's, going east, Eileen Fisher and H&M and C&A and Tesco and Primark, and yeah, we just could go on and on. Shibo in Germany. Like I said, we have about 70 team members in 16 countries, so we're working more deeply in Germany with the German Textile Alliance, people on the ground in Turkey, India, East Africa, West Africa, Latin America. And so it's an awakening. It's really interesting. We're 18 years old, and it's like finally some people are getting some traction. While there's been a lot of organizations doing great things, there's been a certain awakening. I think the pandemic has made people more aware that we must take action now. Certainly all the messages on climate action now are so important. And so a lot of our brands and retailers are moving from what I call a small concept portfolio of like a baby line or a women's line into having a corporate strategy. We're working with a lot of brands and retailers now on what is their portfolio of fibers and what is their strategy on all of them to a preferred solution.
And what sort of interest are you getting from, I don't know, let's say a large domestic orientated Chinese producer who perhaps isn't known in the Western Hemisphere, but it obviously will be selling to millions or tens of millions of customers? Are you seeing rising interest from those kind of big domestic emerging markets?
It's interesting. Yes, I would say there's awakening in India and Brazil and certainly in China. There's some interesting things. We're always a little bit behind the food thing, and so organic food and the more responsible agriculture around food is certainly awakening in China and India. And organic milk is like the leading tip of the spear when it comes to parents and families really supporting that organic message and regenerative agriculture. So yeah, it's really interesting to see that awakening and regional brands coming on board. Definitely.
A friend of mine was a journalist in China when they had the 2008 Olympics. He was very interested to hear from the Chinese that they were getting more and more into organics because of the human health issue rather than the environment issue. And
Yes.
one of the stories he used to tell to highlight that was that the athletes in the 2008 Olympics were told not to eat local pork because they'd fail their drugs tests because of clenbuterol in pig production. So that just goes to show you, what a different operating environment it certainly was, at least back then. What about down the supply chain? I mean, that's always the thing, isn't it, in industries? The tier one is getting it, is very much getting it now, and then the tricky bit is down to tier two, tier three, and those tiers can go a long way down. So just tell us a bit about your reach down through the industry.
Yeah, well, some people may know I do have deep roots down through those tiers. I'm actually an organic cotton farmer myself. Textile Exchange was founded as the Organic Exchange, and our core fiber from the beginning, one of them has been organic cotton. And so cotton is one of those crops that's grown like in 63 different countries, affects millions of people, not only in the production, but in all the different manufacturing stages as well. And so when we founded the exchange, it was with the idea that the end game is not the fiber, it's the process. It's about the fiber being a catalyst to really address the pollution, the poverty, and the problems. And so if we could take that and really embed our work literally from the ground up, is where we've always been working. So we have strong programs on the ground working with farmers in order to make sure they have best practices, they have access to markets, and it's really refreshing to see the number of brands that are starting to connect directly to the farm gate level. Before it was only a token 2 or 3 brands that had some really strong and robust programs. But where we're seeing the growth for not just organic cotton, but other preferred cottons is in the area where those brands are making those connections, making the investments. Change doesn't happen by default. It happens by design. It happens with an investment. Doing the same solution in the same mindset is insanity. Well, we literally have to break the cycle. We have to change the paradigm from a price-only paradigm to where we really understand the intrinsic value that the farmers are investing when they start doing composting and building their soils and putting in an ecosystem to address the biodiversity. So it's very rewarding to see some of the dynamic changes that have been happening in several different countries around the world as they implement more responsible, preferred, and organic cotton practices.
Well, that's a good segue into talking more deeply about cotton, and particularly organic cotton. There seems to be quite a lot of misinformation around about organic cotton. You hear these very conflicting things. There was the stat about a plastic bag and a cotton tote bag being compared for total life cycle impact. And then you hear other stories about people say, oh, well, organic cotton's really lovely for middle class and rich people who can afford it. But if you switch everything to organic cotton, there isn't the land space and there isn't the yield. Whenever I think of organic cotton, I think of a conference I did in 2002 in New York. And we had the then CEO of Patagonia, Michael Cook, his name was. You might have known him back then.
I know Michael well, yeah.
Yeah, he former Navy SEAL, very impressive looking man, isn't he? He's a very good public speaker. I asked him about, how does Patagonia deliver change as a small company? And he said, well, they did a lunch with Nike executives, and the first lunch they had with them was in an organic cotton field. And then the next day they took them to a non-organic cotton field and forced them to have lunch. And then one scene was looked a bit like sort of environmental devastation monoculture, and the other looked like a sort of very different scene, shall we say. And he said that was a lever for change with Nike, and I always was inspired by that story. But then you often heard over the years, that organic cotton is a sort of nice to have, not a must have. Is that wrong, and has it changed dramatically over the last few years?
It's interesting because the principles of organic production are something that are beneficial for the entire agricultural community and industry. So when you think of the levers of change and being the tip of the spear, so I definitely think organic and regenerative agriculture are the tip of the spear. And it's really interesting the challenges on the price dynamics, where the reality is it does cost more to invest in, cover crops and different things like that. There's an investment that has to be made. The continued degradation goes on. So I don't care whether you're talking about cotton or wool or man-made cellulosics. It's when it's been priced. You start making compromise to the environment, compromises to people in order to hit the price point. So as we're really talking about the dynamic changes, it's not just about climate, it's about the sustainable development goals. It's our treatment of people. It's the factories in Bangladesh that woke us up so much, and the ongoing challenges of fair labor and fair prices. That you overlay that dynamic with, the tip of the spear. So we feel like organic embodies that tip of the spear where we'll need to be driving change. But you look at the journey to that point, and it may be that these farmers, they start with crop rotations and they move into building an ecosystem where they're not so dependent upon chemical insecticides, for example, because they have an integrated pest management system. So it's been exciting. You didn't have a lot of these other initiatives. You didn't have the U.S. Cotton Trust Protocol. You didn't have Better Cotton Initiative. You didn't have Cotton Made in Africa. But because organic has been the tip of the spear, implementing and showing the practices that can drive truly transformative change. There's been over a dozen different cotton initiatives, for example, that are adopting some level of best practices along this continuum, along this journey to better practices. It's the tip of the spear, and it's been a long time in coming, but people are finally understanding the dynamics, the importance of doing change. It goes back to, one of the things I've been talking to several brands now is some of them are dabbling in natural capital accounting or EP&Ls. It's like, we can't afford to do this. On the other hand, what's the degradation? What's the cost of restoration? What's the cost of this? And so this whole, again, price to value paradigm, most of our brands in a survey said the number one barrier to adoption of preferred fibers is price. And again, it's not just related to cotton, it's across all the preferred fibers. And so it is about understanding value in a different way. It's going to be an interesting journey over the next few years. And the brands that have figured this out are the ones that have redone their business models, and they're understanding the importance of the EP&Ls.
Yeah, in a way, it makes carbon cuts sound simple by comparison, doesn't it? Because you're just dealing with CO2. But when you're dealing with effectively the health of rural communities and the sustainable development of farmers, it really does bring in an entirely different spectrum of complication, doesn't it?
No doubt about it. One of my favorite sayings is that complex problems require multiple interventions. And so it is about, the dynamics of thriving rural communities. Then you don't have all the young people migrating to cities, creating more urban congestion and the extreme poverty that happens there. But it's the whole revival, not just of the soil, but of those rural communities.
So from a layperson's point of view, are we saying that we shouldn't try and make all global cotton production organic, but we should use organic to drive change through the industry in a way that makes it as environmentally and socially friendly as possible as an industry in the long term?
I think that is certainly a good step in the right direction. I do believe, though, that more organic, regenerative, responsible agriculture is going to be important into delivering to those goals. But having the entire cotton industry on this journey to put soils first is so exciting and so rewarding, because soils first doesn't matter how you grow it, but it creates this dynamic investment in the soils that brings on that life and that biodiversity. And then they can be in a position where they can put in a more robust ecosystem with trap crops and insectary management positions where we can actually reduce those intensive toxic chemicals. It is exciting to see the journey. And yes, I do see organic and regenerative to the tip of the spear driving change and all of it growing.
Well, let's talk about regenerative then. It's a topic that's on everyone's lips at the moment. When Walmart starts talking about becoming a regenerative company, as they did last year, that it's truly hit the mainstream. I'd love to know what the average Walmart shopper thinks of regenerative. You could argue that's a challenge, couldn't you? Because organic, we know what it is. Organic, for all of its good and bad points, it's a list of things you don't do and a list of positive outcomes that then happen as a result. And that's great, but many people will say that's a little bit limited. And so we have this regenerative movement that's coming through. But equally, critics of that I know say, well, it's a recipe for greenwash. It's taking out all these agricultural standards on sustainability we've had for years. Suddenly, everyone's saying they're regenerative. We don't know how to measure soil carbon very accurately. It's all dependent on geology and geography. And then we've got the additionality problem, right? If we want to start measuring it. Soil carbon over here, how do we know it wouldn't have been there anyway? there are challenges with regenerative, and I think it's starting to come under a little bit more scrutiny now. Do you think
Absolutely.
that's a good thing? And does it need to be codified in some way?
Well, it's interesting because the same thing happened when we started using the word sustainable, several years ago. What does it mean? And what is the application about that? So there's certainly going to be people that have abused the word sustainable and have used the word sustainable in a responsible way. We're seeing the same thing, certainly with the word regenerative. And so when you think of regenerative, it is truly about bringing life back into that, regenerating and health and life. And so it's hard to go back. Does it really have to be measured? And the answer would be yes, we need to establish some baselines. And the scientists can argue over the carbon piece, but ultimately, it can be demonstrated in practices. Are you using cover crops? Are you building the soil? Are you putting organic matter back into the soil? And so there can be some very easily visual checks of are there regenerative practices here? And I think you need to look at what is a regenerative practice and what is regenerative agriculture. A practice is something, it's just like a part of an ingredient when you're making blueberry muffins for your grandchildren, for example. So there's an ingredient that goes into what's a regenerative practice for the soil, which is crop rotation and composting and cover cropping. But it is also about the next layer of what is the ecosystem that protects the biodiversity, that gives truly an integrated pest management program. What is that next layer of regenerative agriculture when it comes to looking at the whole system and restorative practices for the riparian areas and making sure there's habitats for other wildlife and species in that region. And so when you look at what is truly regenerative agriculture, there's going to be a whole layer and tiers of practices that need to go into a truly regenerative and restorative system. And it's going to have to be done on that landscape, holistic manner. I also serve on the board of directors for the Regenerative Organic Alliance that has the ROC standard, the Regenerative Organic Certification. And it's really fascinating to see it move from organic, defining, like you say, here's what you do, here's what you don't do for these impacts, into a mindset of we're delivering holistic change that is soils first. It also has the animal welfare component and the social component. So it's about organic plus these practices delivering a more holistic solution. And again, the tip of the spear. It's exciting, though, to see a lot of these organizations, like I mentioned, Better Cotton Initiative, U.S. Cotton Trust Protocol, MyBPM, Agrappa, different organizations around the world. They're like, okay, we don't have a strong soils program. Let's make sure we do. And we establish best practices. And so it's exciting to see that we're implementing and we're able to implement regenerative practices into all of agriculture. And it's not just happening, of course, in cotton, it's happening across the board in all of our food crops and agricultural crops.
So I had an email the other day from someone who said, I'm confused. All this stuff about regenerative, 1 minute it seems to be all about soil. Next minute, it's also about restoring nature and biodiversity. Which one is it? I did a cop-out answer. I said, it depends who you ask. Which is true, but slightly cowardly. Lorraine, what is it? Is it just soil? Or is it also nature? Because I see companies coming out with nature and biodiversity strategies now. So surely they should be talking about regenerative, or should they? Is there a bit of confusion about whether it's soil or whether it's ecosystems? Because not all ecosystems are in the soil, obviously.
I would say it's all of the above because it depends upon what that ecosystem is. If it's an ecosystem that involves soil, then there are certain things that you need to do for the soil. But there's, most ecosystems do involve soil and nature and plants and life. So we're working with forestry systems. The Fashion Pact is focusing on biodiversity in oceans. We're doing a lot of work on what does biodiversity mean in a grazing situation and animal welfare components. What does it mean in cultivated practices? What does it mean in forestry? Because you're right, there's some really great examples of companies and organizations and people that are doing great work, but it's kind of like these islands of good. And so it's time to join those up into going not just on that collective action of people doing good things, but really a connected strategy to drive the best practices forward.
Yeah, that's a great point. So with the Regenerative Organic Alliance and the ROC certification, is that just soil or is that whole ecosystem surrounding a farm, for example?
Yes, it's all the above. It's taking done with organic and layering in more deep work in soils, the animal welfare component, and the social component. So it is that holistic solution of what that entire farm landscape is, and really taking it to the next level of restorative and regenerative practices.
And then how do those certifications sit with trying to look at the rest of the value chain? Because of course, not all impacts are on farm. And look, in grape growing, it can only be 25% of the carbon footprint or GHG footprint of a bottle of wine can actually be in the vineyard, and the rest of it's in the value chain. Whereas in some crops, it's up to 85, 90% is on the farm. So how does that fit in with the rest of the value chain? Is there a need to join up regenerative certification with other sustainability approaches so that we can look at the whole value chain?
Absolutely. It's about teamwork, and it's kind of like a relay race. It's like we're going to run this relay race on the soil and the farm side, and then we need to pass the baton to a spinning mill that is demonstrating the same things. They care about the water. They're doing water. They may be doing regenerative practices in their environment with their water filtration systems and things like that. It is about passing the baton of the right fiber through the right mills in order to deliver the most environmentally responsible product to the consumer. And certification, of course, plays an important role in making sure that we're delivering the intended benefits to the intended beneficiaries. So a chain of custody that protects the farmer and what he's growing, and making sure that it gets to the consumer and the consumer is able to buy a product that they have confidence in, that is actually respecting their values, representing their values, and taking that all the way back to the farmer.
So I was told many years ago that the word sustainability doesn't translate into Russian, for example. Now, with regenerative, in your experience, is it easily understood and translatable into emerging markets and developing economies where, where the rubber hits the road on this sort of thing at the moment? Is it a sort of paradigm and approach that gets people more excited? Because a lot of these farmers have had sustainable agriculture thrown at them in terms of expectations for 15, 20, 30 years. Now we're turning up going, no, it's called regenerative. I mean, how does that go?
Yeah, I was going to say we've had some really good conversations at the farm gate level of I'm organic and that's as good as it's going to get, but they're already using regenerative practices. So it's really interesting. Yeah, there's dynamics happening. I would say as far as the word regenerative, when I've talked to some other countries and cultures, they understand the words in context of like restorative, because they've seen the degradation on the soils. They've seen that they haven't had the opportunity or the resources to invest in best practices around soils. And so they truly understand that next step. And unfortunately, there's been quite a bit of sustainable agriculture that's gone out there that hasn't had that investment at the farm gate on what those best practices are, where the farmers can truly see the benefit of investing in their land. There's a lot of education that needs to happen, no doubt about it, Toby. And that's one of the obstacles of growth and really dynamic change, is that investment of training and training the trainers and the ag systems in the different countries that are available and within those countries. So training and education is going to be an investment, making sure farmers have the right seeds. If, a lot of times the only seeds they get are from the government. If the government's only handing out cotton seeds, then they don't have the clovers and the vetches and the sunflowers and the okras to really plant those diverse crops. And so there's a resource need as well for actually having the tools and resources to implement those best practices.
Of course, that's where your members and big brands can play a key role with helping those on the ground have that kind of capacity, access to finance.
Interventions. Yes, we need those interventions.
Yeah, and I know many of them are already doing that. So 2 more questions for you before we finish. First one is about who else you work with in the cotton supply chain. And then secondly, I want to ask you about what your plans are for the next 3 months until we do our next podcast. Let's do it 3 months at a time. So in terms of how you work with other organizations, BCI, for example, the Better Cotton Initiative, that was sort of everywhere a few years ago. They had these incredibly ambitious targets to reach 5 million farmers by the end of last year, I think, something like that. And the organization seems to have sort of fallen away a bit. I'm just wondering, how do you work with BCI and other organizations in this space, just so our listeners have a clear picture of sort of who's doing what?
Yeah. We actually have a project called the 2025 Sustainable Cotton Challenge. You can find it on our website. We have over now 122 brands that have signed a public commitment to adopt 100% more preferred cottons by 2025. Of course, BCI is one of the ways to get there. So is Cotton Made in Africa, the U.S. Cotton Trust Protocol, MyBMP in Australia, ISCC and Greece and the other areas. So there's 11 different initiatives that we're working with in order to say brands, these are programs that have a mechanism for enrolling farmers, that are training and educating farmers, and are building and delivering on change. And so it's part of that continuum of change. And so everybody's on that step. And so BCI is one of those. We think it's a great first step, and they are certainly evolving. They've committed, like the others, to really implementing a dynamic soils first, a common ground for us all to build soils. So we work directly with them with our Sustainable Cotton Roundtable. They're on our steering committee for the challenge. And so we consider them a strong part of the leadership on this journey toward more responsible, organic, regenerative agriculture.
Great, thank you. And then just to finish off, next 3 months, what does that look like for Textile Exchange? What can we expect to see? And what will you be talking about at our conference on the 27th to 29th of April?
The next 3 months, we will be rolling out our Climate Plus strategy more deeply within our core fibers. So we've talked about cotton today. In collaboration with UNFCCC, we're rolling out an RPET challenge. So I would expect that you're going to hear more about the Climate Plus strategy, the delivery on that 45% reduction of greenhouse gases, and how different fibers are core components and key strategies for delivering to that. So maybe we talk about recycled next time.
Yes, I thought recycled polyester could be a really interesting conversation to have next time, because these materials are all so different, aren't they? But so important. Wonderful. Well, Lorraine, we've taken up enough of your time, listeners, and enough of yours. I think that's been really insightful. So we'll come back in 3 months and see where we've got to. Talk about recycled polyester, and we'll talk about what we learned at the conference. And the conference will be on the 27th to 29th of April 2021. You can find out more on innovationforum.co.uk. Delighted to be working with Textile Exchange on it. And of course, their conference later in the year will be an important milestone that you should also try and attend, so you get the full picture of what's happening around the world on sustainable apparel and textiles. But in the meantime, please give us some feedback on the podcast. Tell us what else you'd like me to ask Lorraine, and we can bring those questions up in the next podcast. But in the meantime, Lorraine, thank you so much for your time today, and we'll look forward to seeing you online at the conference very soon.
Absolutely. Thanks, Toby. Have a lovely day.
Thank you.